Charles Fairbanks' family have been pumping oil for 120 years, which means they've been at it longer than anyone on Earth. Charles gets 40 barrels a day from his wells, enough to make a living, but a mere drop compared with the 20 million barrels Canada devours daily. Things used to be very different, though. Back in the 1880s, Charles' great-grandfather was an oil baron in these parts, and the wells around Petrolia, Ontario, supplied almost all of Canada's needs.
You can forget your Alberta, your Saudi Arabia. The oil industry was invented right here. We had the first well in the world here. We dreamed up techniques that were exported everywhere. Of course we were proud. Man for man, Petrolia was the strongest industrial town in Canada. Heck, we even had an opera house.
But back in the beginning, there was no opera house. There was just uninhabited swamp. Swamp that attracted no one except two would-be entrepreneurs, the Tripp brothers. The Tripps were looking for certain tar or gum beds. The tar had seeped up from oil reserves below the surface. It smelled strongly of sulfur. The Tripps dug the tar up and boiled it into a high-quality asphalt. Unfortunately, there was no crying need for asphalt in the forests of Canada West, and the Tripps went bankrupt. Meanwhile, the industrialized world was running short of grease and oil, lubricants that had been made from the blubber of whales. But the great mammals were disappearing. The time was ripe for James Miller Williams.
All Williams did was to dig a deeper hole than the Tripp brothers. And what comes bubbling into it? Oil. He lined the hole with wood, and that was the world's first oil well. Later on, he used what they call a spring pole to pound down through the rock, down to the deeper reserves. It was brutal work on the spring pole. You might work that treadle for months before you found oil. If you found oil. Now, oil straight out of the ground, it's no use to anyone. All mixed up with mud, water, and dead leaves. So Williams, he built the world's first oil refinery. And he didn't just make lubricants. He started turning out lamp oil or kerosene. That kerosene was so cheap, even the poor could afford to be night owls.
News of Williams' discovery spread. Crowds of drillers descended on oil springs just south of present-day Petrolia. Farmers, tailors, colonels, and cobblers, all mad for oil, or grease, as they called it.
Our conversation is all grease. Our clothes stand up themselves with grease. The furniture is black with it. We toil 18 hours a day and then sleep 4 to a hotel bed and 12 more on the floor beside, dreaming of grease.
There's this stream by the hotel. We wash in it, we cook in it, we even drink it. No one can be bothered to drill for plain old water.
Ladies desirous of admiration had better emigrate to Oil Springs. They might note that the greasers have plenty of money. Though their exterior be rough and their garments oily enough to fry, they've got the dollars.
In Pennsylvania, meanwhile, an even bigger oil boom was in progress.
There's various kinds of oil around, cod liver, castor, sweet, which tend to make a sick man well and set him on his feet. But we a curious trick perform, an oil well we obtain, and set the people crazy with oil on the brain. Stocks down, stalks up, then down again. Everybody's troubled with oil on the brain.
The Yankees had drilled their first well a year later than Williams, but the reserves were larger. In no time, the forests blanketing the Pennsylvania hills were transformed into drilling derricks. The American drillers had an important advantage over their Canadian counterparts. The big rivers that snaked among the oil fields became highways to carry heavy equipment in and oil out.
The lawyers, doctors, hatters, clerks, industrious and lazy have put their money all in stocks, in fact, have gone quite crazy. They'd better stick to briefs and pills, hot irons, ink and pen, or they will kick the bucket from oil on the brain. Stocks down, stocks up, whoa, down again. Everybody's troubled with oil on the brain.
Back in Canada, the boom was faltering. The drillers were using primitive tools, handmade in forges like this one, still operated by Charles Fairbank. Oil production was too low to finance the big drills and industrial forges favored by the Americans. But all that changed when Hugh Shaw, working for 6 agonizing months on his spring pole, working until his shoes wore out, brought in the world's first gusher. Other gushers followed. Soon steam-powered drilling derricks sprang up by the hundreds. By 1862, Oil Springs was producing 12,000 barrels a day.
Charlie Fairbank's great-grandfather, John Henry, he arrived back then. Like a lot of them, he didn't have a cent, but he borrowed money to start his first well. It wasn't easy, though. Oil's a risky business, and these fellas had got themselves hoisted on their own petard. The more oil they found, the less it was worth. One day, a barrel would bring in about 2 weeks' wages, and the next, nothing. So Fairbank, he helped set up the Oil Association to regulate prices. Now today, that'd be illegal, but then it was survival.
In the end, the association was powerless. Almost overnight, the wells ran dry. The population of Oil Springs plunged from 4,000 to 300. But the boom had only moved down the road. The newly discovered oil fields at Petrolia were to flourish for 30 years.
By now, what everyone was after was a gusher. As a gusher meant lots of oil and no need to pump it to the surface. If you did strike one, your problems were over, though, because then you had to stop the darn thing. There were times when the fields were knee-deep in goop. It helped when they started building those big tanks at the wellhead to catch the flow. And of course, they invented those old tanker wagons that came up every so often and drew the stuff off.
If the oil stopped flowing to the surface, it could still be pumped up. Huge tripods were erected above the pumps.
Get up.
The tripods allowed the pumps to be hauled up for servicing.
Of course, we use tractors for this today, not horses. But the basic idea hasn't changed one whit. Every well is different, just like a person. And the oil man, he knows the peculiarities of the well, its way of moving, exactly how much oil it should give. And if anything's just a little bit off, that's when he'll pull pump, haul the whole thing up and have a look. Either that or he'll just give the son of a gun a good boot.
The pumps were often driven by jerker lines. Still in use around Petrolia today, Jerker lines are made of wooden rods that connect the pumps to a central engine house. The engine gives the rods a simple back and forth motion, just enough to drive a pump. The lines often extend for thousands of yards, and until recently, some wove their way through the streets and backyards of Petrolia itself.
Oh, jerker lines, they're great. Until you have to shovel them out after a snowstorm. Nothing can be allowed to stop the oil from flowing, you see. And I've seen crews shoveling for half the night. And often as not, by the time they got to the end of 10 miles or so of line, the beginning'd be all snowed in again.
By the 1860s, oil was flowing in record quantities. But the wagons were getting it out in a mere trickle, thanks to the rutted, swampy road to the rail depot. The Petrolia men lobbied the railways for a spur line, but the conservative railways, fearing the boom would collapse, refused. So the Petrolians built their own line.
Once we had the railway, all of Canada was our market. All of Canada. That was really the beginning of our golden era.
The golden era had its dangerous side, thanks to the practice of bringing in wells with nitroglycerin. The nitro was packed in long tubes or torpedoes and lowered gently into a well. It was set off by dropping a heavy weight on it. But accidents did happen. There were 5 nitro factories on the outskirts of Petrolia, and every one of them blew up.
You have to sympathize with the fellows who carted this stuff around. Old Harry McManus, he used to keep what he called his nerve medicine under the seat of his wagon. His 80 proof nerve medicine. Well, one day he hit a bump he shouldn't have. Poor Harry. With all that nerve medicine in him, there wasn't much left. Just a heap of junk.
Fire was another danger in a town where everything was saturated with oil. If the fumes from a storage tank met the business end of a cigar, the results could be catastrophic.
There were 2 fire brigades, one from the east end and one from the west, and they were great rivals. One time they were heading for the same fire and they ran smack into each other. Well, there was quite a Donnybrook, and meanwhile the fire was ripping merrily away.
Fire prevention received a boost when a bylaw required that places of business be built in brick. Petrolia Street took on a more permanent air. But there were other problems.
The stench from the reservoirs of oil is very offensive. It smells something like a compound of onions and gas tar, and though the residents refer to it as the smell of money, it well nigh poisons a stranger. Water taken from the wells is most nauseous.
Yet for all its rough edges, Petrolia grew into a solid Victorian family town. Its rich, of whom there were many, built mansions which seemed to declare that Petrolia's prosperity would last forever. The central monument to that hope was the new town hall, whose second floor contained an opera house, seating 1,000 people. Though the hands of the founders were black with oil, their children had time for other pursuits. Needlepoint, theatricals, etiquette, lectures on sanitation in ancient Rome, and of course, sports, and more sports. Yet the town's confidence was rooted in more than baseball championships. In the 1880s, Jacob Engelhart moved the refineries of the all-Canadian company Imperial Oil from London to Petrolia. Now, Canada's biggest producers and refiners were in the same neighborhood.
When Imperial came in, that made us feel like the center of the country. We knew that if a mechanic in Hamilton or a farmer in Nova Scotia was oiling up his machine, he was probably doing it with oil from Petrolia. So we felt big, really big back there in the 80s and 90s. And this little old town was keeping the whole country running smoothly.
Machine shops hummed day and night to turn out the parts needed to keep the wells pumping. A few are still in operation.
It wasn't just a matter, you see, of turning out the same old parts that had always been made. Fellas here had invented the industry, and they went right on creating new machines. Anything that would make it cheaper to get the oil out. You take a company like Oil Well Supply. That outfit was world famous. They had salesmen in London and Australia, and their catalog listed all sorts of gizmos. Wherever oil was pumped, you'd see equipment from Petrolia. Now, if you go down today to Oil Well Supply, you'll see them using techniques they invented way back then. I'm telling you, with the knowledge that was concentrated in this town, you could have started a university. Metallurgy, industrial forge work, fine tooling. We knew it all. And if a letter came in from one of the new oil fields over there in Asia or South America saying, "We need help, boys. One of our bits broke off and it's jammed a well," then the fellas here, if they didn't have a tool to solve that problem, then they darn well sit down and invent one.
But Petrolia's greatest gift to the world was her men. By the late 1800s, oil was being found in places like Egypt, Iran, and Venezuela. The skill of petroleans was in great demand, and hundreds of the so-called foreign drillers headed overseas.
Dear Roy, we have a nice little Canadian colony here. I think there is altogether about 24, and I understand there is more to come. I don't know where the company is going to put them, as they are very short of bungalows at present. I am living with James McTavish of Bothwell and Billy Davies. Well, we have been over and had lunch. The food here is very poor, and they cook everything in grease.
The foreign drillers get too much of the limelight. Sure, they were brave and put up with poisoned arrows and mosquitoes and all that, but what about the women they left back in Petrolia? There were dozens of women here who raised their families single-handed, while they were off making their $10 a day and having a sweet old time, some of them. They only got back home once every 4 or 5 years, and a few never bothered coming back at all.
Wherever the foreign drillers met, their greeting was the same: a boast that they could get oil out of solid rock.
Hard oil!
Meanwhile, in the United States,
There's catch 'em and cheat 'em and lure 'em and beat 'em and swindle 'em all in a row. Then coax 'em and lead 'em and leech 'em and bleed 'em and guzzle and sink 'em and co. Oh, oh, oily firms pay
J.D. Rockefeller had the vast American oil industry in his pocket.
They pay.
Using his control of the railways, he had forced his competitors into submission. His Standard Oil expanded into Canada. No one would lend Imperial the money to meet this new competition. And in 1898, the Canadian company was bought out by its American rival. That year, its refineries were moved to Sarnia, close to the river and its tankers. A third of Petrolia's economy evaporated. It was the beginning of the end.
That was the turnaround. That was the turnaround. Until Standard Oil came in, the whole shebang was ours. Wells, refineries, distribution. We had a pride, you see, that we could do it all. But after the sellout, we had the feeling that the center wasn't here. It wasn't with us anymore.
I blame the government for letting Standard in the first place. How could we compete against a giant like that?
How indeed. Yet neither the government nor Standard was entirely to blame. Canada was using oil faster than Petrolia could produce it. And now another oil-hungry machine appeared. In 1890, Canada imported only 17% of her oil. By 1903, over 60% was coming from abroad. Then in 1908, the wells themselves stopped flowing. There was still oil in the ground, but the cost of pumping it had become prohibitive. Many oilmen left for Alberta and the States, where newly discovered flowing wells ensured cheaper oil at the wellhead. Another third of Petrolia's economy disappeared. The boom was at an end. But not all was doom and gloom in 1908. That year, the foreign drillers came home for one of the warmest old boys reunions anywhere. Men who had grown up together, who had learned their business in the same rigs, now met after years apart in the far corners of the world.
I was just a kid when the foreign drillers came home. Oh, I remember it was a hot, hot week in August. The drillers didn't mind the weather, though. The places they'd been. And the stuff they brought with them. Strange coins and stamps and old curved swords and bolts of cloth. There was one fella, he brought a whole collection of parrots. Big red and green ones and a little white-headed one, no bigger than a canary.
In the 20th century, Petrolia's wells have filled only a small fraction of Canada's needs. Yet recently, with the great increases in the price of oil, some of the old family fields have become profitable again. Every month, Charles Fairbank sends over 1,000 barrels to the refineries in nearby Sarnia. Here, they're added to the millions of barrels arriving from Alberta.
People sometimes ask me, what are these refineries doing in Sarnia when the oil fields are 2,000 miles away? Well, I say the refineries are here because Petrolia's here. Petrolia, they say? Well, how do you begin to tell them? That we invented the oil industry here, that we were famous, not just in Canada, but around the world. We were really something.